All right, so we're going to cover three sections. We're going to go till about, so right now it is 11:48 Central Time. I'm actually in Chicago. I'm sitting at John Sand's desk, and we're going to go for about an hour and 10 minutes, and then we're going to put you on your lunch break. Your lunch break is going to go till 2 o'clock Central Time. So if you're on the East Coast, that's going to be 3 p.m. And if you're on the West Coast, that would be noon. And then Eric Reniger is going to take it from 2 p.m. Central on and wrap it up. Okay. And these are fairly short topics over here, so we may not need the full 2 hours, but we'll see how we do there. So let's see. So we're going to start with here. If I go back to the course, so let's go back. I'll share. So this is, I'm back in Chrome here. So if we go back home here and look at the list here, again, we've done some of this out of order just based on availability of some of our faculty. But so I'm going to cover Module 6, Configuration Management, Module 7, Identification and Authentication, and then come down here and all the way to the end, System and Information Integrity. And then Eric is going to come back and wrap it up for you today. So if you look at this, and I think some of this still needs to be updated from version 1.0. So again, configuration management here, but some of this information here is a little bit outdated. So we'll go through the slides, and that will really help to crystallize what we're talking about today. So let me jump to configuration management here, and let me open a chat window in case anybody has questions. Okay. All right. All right. So configuration management, the key thing that I want you to get out of this one here, and let me open a, where's my pointer here? I don't see a pointer. But again, when you think about configuration management, we think about the system development life cycle, and again, anything that can be configured and has to be configured, and basically managing that whole life cycle there. So it's essentially here establishing and maintaining the integrity of information technology products and systems. And so that includes the control of processes for initializing, changing, monitoring the configuration of those products and systems throughout that whole life cycle. So again, the initial configuration, any changes to that configuration, and then monitoring those configurations. So again, all of that has to be managed through that life cycle. Good. John is in 101 if you need to see him. Okay. All right. So, and again, most of us are probably familiar in a lot of our workplaces with the idea of configuration management and change management, that if you want to make a change, not only does it have to be approved, but then you initiate that change, and then you have to monitor that configuration change to make sure that it's working properly and troubleshoot it and have a plan to roll it back if there happens to be an issue. Okay. All right. And again, this is the new CMMC 2.0, what I like to call the slimmed down version of CMMC. And so in this case, again, this is renamed to basic with level 1 with the same 17 practices. And now at level 2, 110 practices. And again, it links to the NIST 800-171, and then you have the older renamed advanced versus intermediate. And again, those make up level 2 and 3. Okay. And I would say that document from NIST is always a good reference. You want to have that one handy because it really You'll see all the language that appears in these slides and all the language that appears in the CMMC. You'll see that appear in those. And you'll also see a little bit more detail and explanation of what's going on with some of these. So let's take a look at level 2 over here. So in level 2, configuration management, and let me try to get my cursor going again here. No, for whatever reason, that doesn't want to work. All right, so system baselining. So again, in information security and in even information technology, we always talk about baselining. So in this case, it's basically getting a baseline configuration and inventories of all of our systems. So that includes not only our hardware, but also our software, firmware, and any required documentation throughout that development life cycle. Okay. Then security configuration enforcement. We want to have some way to establish and enforce that security configuration settings for all of our products in our organization. We want to have a process in place for system change management. So again, be able to track changes, be able to review them, approve them, disapprove them, and then log the changes to the organizational systems. And as I said earlier, we also want that ability that if we are monitoring those changes and we find that we have some unexpected consequences, we can roll those back. So for example, years ago at my college, I'm from Brookdale Community College in New Jersey. We had computer labs that were focused for teaching CAD. All right, so we had AutoCAD installed in those computer labs. And at the time, it was Windows XP Service Pack 1. And I had some aides that managed that lab for me. And Service Pack 2 for Windows XP came out, and these the aides went in, unlocked all the systems, and updated all the machines to Windows XP Service Pack 2, and it turned out that Autodesk had not vetted Service Pack 2 yet to work with AutoCAD. So basically, they broke AutoCAD, and it was in the middle of the semester. We were running classes, so we had to roll back all those systems. So that was a case where the staff there took it on their own to go ahead. They figured this is the latest update to the operating system, and it's always a good practice to keep your operating systems up to date. But because these systems are running software, either they should have, number one, done some research to see whether Service Pack 2 was supported, and then also ran it up the chain of command to make sure with our IT people that this was a change that they approved and we could go ahead and do. So not something they should be doing on their own. Right? Luckily, we were able to just roll back the systems, but it again gives you a little bit of a scare there because you're worried that you're not going to be able to run classes for a couple of days and then students are going to fall behind. Right. And then finally, the security impact analysis. And this one, I would say, security is a growing concern. And back when we had that lab, you think Windows XP, you're thinking about 2003. That's security was not as big a concern in those days. And so I don't think, other than just keeping our systems updated and patched, which is what these assistants were trying to do, we weren't thinking about the security impacts of these sort of updates and patches to our operating system. So again, in this case, we want to analyze the impact and changes prior to that implementation. All right, so let's take a look at each one of these. So again, this is level 2 configuration management. And so these are just the bullets that we had listed earlier. And so if you see here, we have establish and maintain baseline configurations and inventories of organizational systems. And so the inventories is a big piece of that. So you want to know not only the hardware, the software, but also the firmware. So you think about devices that can have their firmware flashed and updated, and also any documentation that we have. And we want to be able to keep that through the life cycle of these systems, throughout the life cycle of these respective systems. So if you look at the audit objective over there, we establish a baseline. So that baseline includes the hardware, software, firmware, and documentation. The baseline configuration is maintained. So what that means is we review it and we update it periodically throughout that system development lifecycle. The system inventory is established. The system inventory, again, includes hardware, software, firmware, and documentation. And then that system inventory is maintained, again, reviewed and updated throughout the system development lifecycle. Now, one of the things that we explored at my college was RFID. So RFID, if you're not familiar with it, radio frequency identification. So the same technology that we use with Easy Pass and some of the other toll-based systems that we use on our highways. And so the idea here, we would use this for inventory control, and that we would have RFID tags on each of the systems. And so those RFID tags would not only have information about the system, because again, the RFID tags can be programmed with information, but they would also have information about what version of the operating system was running, information about the specific hardware, what applications and versions were running. So you could potentially put all of that information on these RFID tags. You could walk around the room with a handheld RFID interrogator or reader, and basically you could basically collect all the inventory information for a room in real time. Right. We did do a small pilot with it, and they also looked at using it for inventory tracking by having readers in the top of the doorway, where you could basically track if someone took a piece of equipment and walked out of the room with it. But it turned out in the end that, again, financially, they didn't think it was viable to be able to do this. Okay. The solution instead was to lock down the systems with deep freeze. And again, in industry, you might not be familiar with deep freeze, but in academia, we use deep freeze a lot. So deep freeze is a product that basically has a separate partition on the hard drive and has a copy of the entire hard drive. And every time you reboot the system or power cycle the system, it restores that partition back to the hard drive. So it gives you the advantage. Somebody could go in and maliciously delete the Windows system directory on the computer. All you have to do is power cycle the computer and everything will return. Okay. All right. So the inventory, as I said, we have to review and update both of those. So again, baseline configuration and system inventory. Those are the two pieces of this. Okay. And then acceptable evidence. So an organization, you want to have a configuration management policy, and large organizations already have that. Smaller ones may not, but it also has to be communicated to everyone in the organization so that you don't run into the problem that we had at my college, where somebody is changing the configuration or updating it without authorization. Again, procedures addressing the baseline configuration of the system. So the baseline configuration, one of the nice things about that is you can create baseline configurations, which give you our initial settings that all the systems are going to use, and which includes the security settings of the system. And by using that baseline, we know that we're going to have that baseline security and performance that we want out of all those systems. And again, once you have that baseline configuration, again, you can use a product like Norton Ghost to basically clone systems and basically have every system have the same baseline configuration. We want to have procedures in place for system inventory. We want to look at the system security plan, the configuration management plan. So again, that's part of the policy. The policy is going to be sort of the umbrella that gives sort of the policy of who's in charge and who's responsible. And then the change management plan or the configuration management plan is going to be the nuts and bolts, the specifics of what happens. We have our system inventory records, and hopefully those are electronic. We keep ours, our Office of Information Technology has those on their website. So you can go in at any time and you can look at a room, you can look at a classroom, and it will basically bring up what's in that classroom, what software is installed. And by having a baseline configuration, that simplifies a lot of that, because if there is customization, the customization is done for that classroom, and then that that particular machine, one machine is then cloned, or we use Norton Ghost to do that at our college. Right. And then we want to have a system for inventory review and updating records. Our enterprise architecture documentation is another important piece of it. The system design documentation, system architecture and configuration documentation, system configuration settings and associated documentation, change control record. So again, if somebody initiates a change or requests a change, you have documentation of all of those changes, whether they were approved or denied, and the outcome of those changes. We have system component installation records, system component removal records, and then any other relevant documents or records. So lots of documentation that we can collect for baselines and inventories. In terms of inventory interviews, baseline and inventory interviews here. So whoever the individual is, or individuals with configuration management responsibilities, the personnel responsible for establishing the system inventory, the personnel with responsibilities for updating that system inventory, and often they're going to be the same. And then the personnel with information security responsibilities, and again, that's at a higher level. And then finally, our system or network administrators. And as we go through these, you'll see a lot of the same roles repeated in some of these interviews, because often it's going to be those same individuals that have to get interviewed for this. All right, so evaluate and test. So we want to look at our organizational processes for managing those baseline configurations. We want to look at the systems, the mechanisms for supporting configuration control of the baseline configuration, our processes for developing and documenting our inventory, our processes for updating the inventory, and then mechanisms for supporting or implementing the system inventory, and mechanisms for updating that inventory. Okay, so that's that first one, baseline configurations and inventories of our systems. All right, next we have here the second one here under configuration management. And again, this is level 2, establish and enforce security configuration settings for information technology products employed in organizational systems. And so as you would expect, so if you look at the previous one, if we go back over here, the previous one established the baseline configuration and inventories. In this one is now includes the enforcing the configuration settings. Okay, so a little bit heavy-handed, more heavy-handed here. So basically, the objectives here determine if the security configuration settings employed in the system are established and included in the baseline configuration. So it's not enough that you have a baseline configuration. Does it include my security configuration settings? So ultimately, CMMC is about information security. So that's why we want to make sure that that baseline configuration includes the required security configuration settings. And then finally, not only that we include those in our baseline, but those are enforced. All right, so that's the second part of that objective. And you'll see the objectives play out a lot like that, where you have something identified and defined, and then basically it's either implemented or enforced. All right, in terms of evidence, again, we go back to our configuration management policy. So we should see that that has something about our security configurations and enforcing those. Our baseline configurations, our procedures for configuration settings for the system. Again, going back to our configuration management plan. Remember, that's the nuts and bolts plan of how we do it. The system security plan. So again, the system security plan and the configuration management plan then have that Venn diagram where the two overlap, where we have to make sure that our security information gets into the configuration, our security settings, our system design documentation, configuration settings and documentation, security configuration checklists. And so We do that a lot now. We're teaching that a lot to students where they're going through, and you can get some of these checklists and as a starting point. SANS, the SANS Institute, NSA provides some hardening guides and security configuration checklists that you can use as a starting point. But it gives someone a nice little document that they can basically check off and make sure that they've met all the requirements, or they've checked off all the things they need to do in their configuration in terms of security. Then we have evidence that supports approved decisions from deviation, from our established configuration settings. So if we have any configuration settings that we have to tweak or modify for one department or one area, then we want to have evidence that supports that decision or that deviation. And again, particularly if it's going to impact our security posture or our attack surface. If it's just something like installing some customized software, that's not going to. You still want to have evidence supporting that decision or that deviation. But if it's something in particular that's going to impact our security, then we definitely want to make sure that that's included. So one example I can give you is we have in some of the classrooms, we have software where the instructor can manage the other machines. So it's there's a server that runs on the instructor machine, and there's a client that runs on all of the desktop machines and the students' desktop machines. And from that, we can actually monitor, so we can view on our screen what the students are doing. We can take over a system. We can lock their mouse, lock their keyboard. We can disable internet access on their machines. And when the IT technician came the first time they wanted to set that up and install it, they were having difficulty having the client part of the software see the server part of the software. And so they were experimenting with disabling the firewall on the instructor machine so that that could get in. But ultimately, then they had to determine which ports they needed to open up in the firewall, and then they had to basically request a deviation from the standard firewall settings to allow that software to work. All right. And then once that was approved, then they were able. So for testing, they just disabled the firewall temporarily so that they could see that it was a firewall issue. And then they just had to do a little bit of research to figure out exactly which firewall settings they needed, and they had to get that deviation from our standard firewall configuration approved. We also take a look at change control records, system audit logs and records, and then any other relevant documents or records. And when you think about all of this evidence, a lot of this evidence, this works great for compliance and for working with an external auditor to review your systems, but just organizationally having all this information so that you have everything documented. So for example, if they want to install that software in another computer lab, they know now exactly the procedures they have to take in order to enable that software to work with the firewall, right? So that documentation not only helps to give us a paper trail to see exactly what happened, gives us some auditing information that we can provide to an external auditor, but it gives us some help in doing future changes within the organization. All right, interviews. Again, anyone with security configuration management responsibilities, information security personnel, and then all our system or network administrators. And what do we evaluate and test here? So we want to test the processes for managing configuration settings, the mechanisms for implementing, monitoring, or controlling the configuration settings, the mechanisms for identifying or documenting deviations from those established configuration baselines, those configuration settings, particularly, I would say all of them, but particularly anything that's going to impact our security profile. Processes for managing our baseline configurations, and then mechanisms for supporting configuration control of baseline configurations. All right, the next one here was track, review, approve, or disapprove, and log changes to organizational systems. So when you look at the audit evidence for this one here, changes to the system are tracked, changes to the system are reviewed, changes to the system are approved or disapproved, and changes to the system are logged. Now, if you look at this, the language in here compared to what it looked like in version 1.0 of CMMC, it's a lot simpler and a lot more direct. And so it's very easy to talk to your staff, to talk to employees, to talk to the organization about. We want to make sure the changes are tracked, reviewed, approved or disapproved, and systems are logged. So basically everything is it follows that path there. All right, and what's the evidence? So again, our configuration management policy, remember that's sort of the 30,000 foot level policy there for configuration management. The actual procedures for system configuration change control, the more nuts and bolts configuration management plan, the system architecture and configuration documentation, the system security plan. Again, you can't talk about configuration management plans and configuration management without overlapping with the system security plan to make sure that we are abiding by that. Change control records over here, system audit logs and records, change control audit and review reports, agenda minutes from the oversight meetings for configuration change, and then relevant documents or records. And so if you look back at the audit objective, again, if you sort of follow this very straightforward, this is almost sort of a straight line checklist that creates a nice paper trail for documentation of, again, changes are tracked, they're reviewed, approved or disapproved, and then they're logged. And if you can basically show those, that gets you a long way to having that acceptable evidence. All right, interviews. Again, the personnel that manage configuration change control, information security personnel, system or network administrators. And now, because we have this oversight role over here, agenda and minutes from a control oversight meetings, we now add members of the change control board or similar. All right. And again, it's not a bad idea to have a board like that, particularly when you start to look at potential requested modifications or deviations that may be more dicey, that they might want to be more discussion of. So if you have a group responsible for oversight of that, that's going to give you, again, a better way to be able to make those decisions as an organization rather than just having one individual CISO or CIO make that decision. And then how do we test it? So we look at our organizational processes for configuration change control, and then we look at the mechanisms for implementing the configuration change control. All right, so that one was, again, track, review, approve or disapprove, and log changes to the organizational systems. That's one of the more straightforward ones that we'll see. The next one is, again, a critical one here before we implement them. And that's the key thing. Prior to implementation, we want to analyze the security impact of changes prior to the implementation. And so that could be done theoretically. It could be done by doing some research on the changes that we're implementing, or it could be done by implementing these changes in a sandbox or a virtual environment and then testing the security impact of those before we put it into production. All right, so do it in a development environment, a sandbox, and then roll it out to a production environment. So here, very simple objective here. The security impact of changes to the system is analyzed or are analyzed prior to implementation. And that's something that's fairly straightforward. And the challenge there is, if you don't have a strong organizational controls for this, you do have the situation that I described at my college that happened in the early 2000s, where one individual who has administrative rights to those systems was able to bypass all of that. And again, they didn't impact the security, but they impacted the availability of those machines. So the software, the AutoCAD software, would no longer run in that Service Pack 2 of Windows XP. All right, acceptable evidence. So again, our policy, the procedures for addressing security impact analysis for system changes. And again, I would suggest a combination of what I mentioned. So it's not only a theoretical where you're looking at the documentation for the changes, the documentation for the system, and seeing if and then looking in vendor forums to see if there's any documented issues with that change that you're trying to implement. But then also testing it in a development environment before you roll it out for productions. And again, those are very straightforward, very sensible things to implement for anything that an organization is doing. By the way, if you remember, I think it was last summer that we had the SolarWinds hack, and the SolarWinds hack was one of the first, what we refer to now as a supply chain attack. And remember, we think of supply chains, we think of a truck full of toothpaste showing up at Walmart, but in this case, it was the software supply chain. So what was hacked was SolarWinds update server, so that the malware, the malicious software, was embedded in one of the updates on their update server. So when legitimate customers reached out and updated their software, they were getting compromised update patches or updates from SolarWinds. And so lots of lessons to be learned there. But interestingly, one of the things that I read about with that particular attack was the attackers let the malware lay dormant for a period of time before it went active. And so that period of time was random. So it wasn't a specific number of days, but it averaged around 14 days. And so what they were anticipating was that a network administrator, a system administrator, would download those patches, run them and test them in a sandboxed environment, in a virtual machine, and make sure that everything was working properly. So if that was dormant for 14 days, and again, they did some research on about how long people do that sandboxing and testing. So if it's dormant for on average 14 days, that malware is not going to appear, and everything looks good, and then you deploy it to your production environment, and then it appears. Right. So very, very clever malware attack there that they did with that supply chain attack. Right. So here again, now the nuts and bolts configuration management plan, the security impact analysis documentation. So as part of that analysis. So what, and again, I talked about theoretical research, go to vendor sites, go to vendor forums. You can even in Twitter today, there's even going to be, if people are experienced, there's a big information security community on Twitter. And so if people are experiencing issues with software updates or things like this, they will share that information in Twitter as well. So any resources that you have to keep up to date on things like that, and then sandboxing and testing those updates before you roll them out to the organization as a whole. So as part of that, you document that security impact analysis so that you have a paper trail that shows we did this research and saw there were no implications for security by installing this change. And we also tested it in a sandbox environment from this date to this date and didn't observe any security problems with that. Our system security plan, again, in today's environment, change management, configuration management can't sit in a silo separate from system security planning. Analysis tools and outputs. So that were tools that we could use in that development environment where we're testing it. Change control records, our system audit logs and records, and then any other relevant documents or records. And then who we interview, again, the same ones or the same suspects as before. So anybody, the new one here is anybody who's responsible for conducting security impact analysis. All right. So again, that's often going to be are system or network administrators, or it could be somebody with information security responsibility. So there might be overlap with those people, but that new role there, security impact analysis. And finally, how do we evaluate it? What are our organizational processes for security impact analysis? So what do we do as an organization if we're planning to implement a change or examining a change? What do we do to actually explore what the security impact will be of that particular change? Okay. All right. Now, as we continue here, we have 3.4.5, and again, the numbering has changed from version 1 of CMMC, but here, access restrictions for change. So you want to define, document, approve, and enforce physical and logical access restrictions associated with changes to these systems. Lease functionality, that's sort of an umbrella one in all of information security, but with configuration management, we want the principle of lease functionality by having organizational systems to provide only essential capabilities. Okay. Restrict, disable, or prevent the use of non-essential programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. So again, non-essential functionality is removed. Application execution policy. You want to have some sort of deny by exception or blacklisting policy to prevent unauthorized software, or do a deny all, permit by exception, a whitelisting policy to allow the execution of only authorized software. And then finally, user installed software, control and monitor user installed software. All right, so in where my college is in New Jersey, we have AT&T used to be right around the corner from us, and then Bell Labs and Bellcore. And we still have a lot of people who work in the county at AT&T, and we have a lot of adjuncts from AT&T that teach for me. And in the old days of AT&T, if you wanted to install software, so even if you were an engineer, you wanted to install some specialized engineering software, or you were a network administrator and you wanted to install some software and test it, you had to get permission from IT. So even these senior employees didn't have the ability to install software on their own machines. I haven't asked if that's still the case today, but again, it was very locked down, and one of the reasons for that was you didn't want an employee accidentally installing software that could cause security issues with the organization and with their systems. All right, so the first one here is define, document, approve, and enforce physical and logical access restrictions associated with changes. So obviously we know the physical restrictions are basically doors, locks, could be locking down USB ports on devices, could be disabling USB ports on devices. And then logical access control is going to be, for example, limiting IP addresses that can access certain materials, limiting putting different devices on different VLANs so that you don't have access for everybody. So if you look at this, the physical access restrictions associated with changes to the system are defined, then they're documented, then they're approved, then they're enforced. All right, so physical access restrictions associated with changes to the system. So what can someone physically do on a system, on an IT system or an information system? Then logical access restrictions, again, they're defined, documented, approved, and enforced. And again, I really like the way that they've changed this in CMMC 2.0, and they've made it much more clear and direct. And it's again, we have physical access restrictions. We're going to define them. We're going to document them. We're going to have a process for approving them and then for enforcing them. And then the same thing for logical access. So very clear, very step-by-step. And again, I think very easy, much easier to document when you think of it in terms of those discrete steps there. So again, the evidence here are configuration management policy, the procedures for addressing access restrictions for changes to the system. Okay. All right. Hopefully, yeah, thanks for letting me know. All right, system security plan, configuration management plan, system design documentation, architecture and configuration documentation, configuration settings. Now here we have logical access approvals and physical access approval. So we actually document that information there as part of this so that we can show that we have that process in place. So if you look at the audit objective, again, in the end, we want to have all of that information documented, from defining it, documenting it, approving it, and enforcing it. So in this case, oops, I went the wrong way. So in this case, again, having those approvals documented, having access credentials. So one of the ways that you're going to limit access is through access credentials, change control records, system audit logs and records, and then any other relevant documents or records. Then you have interviews. So again, someone responsible for logical access control, someone responsible for physical access control, and then our information security, and then our network and system administrators. And how do we test this? We look at our organizational processes for managing access restrictions, and then the mechanisms supporting, implementing, enforcing access restrictions with regard to those changes to the system. All right, next, we talked about lease functionality. So in this case, we employ the principle of lease functionality by configuring our organizational system to provide only the essential capabilities. Okay. So here, essential system capabilities are defined based on the principle of leased functionality, and then the system is configured to provide only the defined essential capabilities. So basically define them based on leased functionalities and then configure it so that that's what we're achieving. Okay. And the evidence here, again, the policy and the plan, procedures for addressing leased functionality in a system, our system security plan, system design documentation, system security, system configuration settings, excuse me, our system configuration checklists again, and then any other relevant documents or records. And if we look at the interviews over here, again, security configuration management personnel, information security personnel, and then system or network administrators. So when these interviews happen, you have a few people that are going to be very busy being interviewed. And then finally, what do we test? We test our organizational processes that prohibit or restrict functions, ports, protocols, or services, and then mechanisms implementing restrictions or prohibitions of functions, ports, protocols, and services. So it's not only the processes that we have for that, but then the mechanisms where we actually implement it. All right, non-essential functionality. So here it's to restrict, disable, or prevent the use of non-essential programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. All right, so again, if you look at it, we break it down first by non-essential or programs. So in this case, we define the essential programs, and then the use of non-essential programs is defined, and the use of non-essential programs restricted, disabled, or prevented. Right? Then we have essential functions, and then those are defined, as well as the non-essential functions. And again, the use of those is restricted, disabled, or prevented. Essential ports are defined. The use of non-essential ports is defined, and then the use is restricted, disabled, or prevented. Essential protocols are defined. The use of non-essential protocols is defined, and then again, restricted, disabled, or prevented. And then finally, the same thing for essential services. So this one, I have to tell you honestly, I'm not really comfortable with the way this is laid out here, is that we start with essential programs defined and then define the non-essential programs defined. And so I think on my own thought is that once you define the essential programs, anything outside of that circle is then deemed non-essential, and then you don't have to define the non-essential programs. All right, but again, I don't know if they were looking for some potential loophole there that they wanted to address with that. All right, so again, our configuration management policy. Now, in this case, procedures addressing lease functionality in the system, our configuration management plan, our system security plan, system design documentation, back to our checklist, the configuration settings, specifications for preventing software program execution. So how do we actually implement that? Documented reviews of programs, functions, ports, protocols, and their services. So if we're going to define what's essential and what's non-essential, we have to have that process documented. Change control records, and then system audit logs and records to demonstrate that we're actually limiting the functionality of those non-essential items, and then other relevant documents or records. Who do we interview? So the first one here is a new one. So this one is the person responsible for reviewing programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services on the system. And then you have our information security personnel, system or network administrator. And another one that we haven't seen yet in this chapter here is system developers. So the system developers, because if we have to implement this whitelisting, blacklisting, whatever we're going to call it, we have to have some way of doing that, and that may involve some system development or some coding. And then evaluate and test, basically our processes for reviewing and disabling non-essential items, the mechanisms for implementing the review and handling of non-essential items, the organizational process preventing program execution, the organizational process for software program usage and restrictions, and then the mechanisms for supporting or implementing software program usage and restrictions, and then mechanisms for preventing program execution on the system. So you can see these last four. The first one are focused on processes, and then the other ones are mechanisms. So it's more about now implementing. So this is, do you have a process in place? And now how is that implemented? All right. The next one here is application execution policy, and this is where the whitelisting shows up over here. So apply, deny by exception. So this is blacklisting. So basically you blacklist individual applications to prevent the use of unauthorized software, or the other approach is deny all by default, and then you permit by exception. So that's whitelisting. So basically everything is denied, and then you apply exceptions to software and applications that are allowed to run. So the audit objective here is we need to determine if there's a policy specifying whether whitelisting or blacklisting is to be implemented. This software allowed to execute under whitelisting or denied use under blacklisting is specified. And then whitelisting to allow the execution of authorized software, or blacklisting to prevent unauthorized software is implemented. Okay. And in my experience, and again, sometimes this becomes really problematic, especially when you have a lot of new applications showing up and you have users. And now when you have mobile devices and tablets and you have bring your own device, trying to whitelist and blacklist becomes an administrative nightmare at times. So good idea in practice, but implementing whitelisting and blacklisting can sometimes be overly burdensome. All right, what do we review here? Our acceptable evidence here, our configuration management policy, procedures for addressing lease functionality, our system security plan. Again, you can't look at configuration without our system security, configuration management plan, the nuts and bolts plan, system design documentation, configuration settings, list of software programs not authorized to execute, list of software programs authorized to execute, security configuration checklists, review and update records associated with a list of authorized or unauthorized software programs. So again, part of the problem with the whitelisting, blacklisting is that list of software, whether it's allowed or denied, is a moving target. Okay. Change control records, system audit logs, and then any other relevant documents or records. And who do we interview? So someone here responsible for identifying software that's authorized or not authorized, and then our information security professionals and system or network administrators. And how do we test it? We look at the organizational process for identifying, reviewing, and updating programs authorized or not authorized. And again, the identifying is the easy part, but then reviewing that periodically and then updating it, that becomes the challenge, keeping that up to date. And then the process for implementing the blacklist or the whitelist. And finally, mechanisms supporting or implementing the blacklist or the whitelist. So remember, it's the process, and then we implement it with the mechanism. All right. And then finally, user install software, control and monitor user install software. One of the challenges we have at my organization, again, we're just a two-year college, but we have staff who during their lunch break might download a free solitaire game they find online, or they might download over the holidays, they might download a holiday screensaver that they'd like to have on their computer, and they install that. A lot of times that could install just adware, it could install spyware, malware, who knows what. But again, just making sure that we have some control and monitoring over what users are installing on their systems. And again, in spite of all of the security awareness training, we still have users who, again, make the mistake of going to sketchy websites and downloading a screensaver that they just like. All right. So here we have a policy for controlling the installation of software by users is established. The installation by users is controlled based on the policy, and then the installation of software by users is monitored. All right. So in a we're not a high security environment. I mean, again, we do want security, but again, the risk of what's going to be on an office assistant's desktop computer is not as great as what's going to be on the chief financial officer's desktop. Evidence here are policy, procedures for addressing user installed software, configuration management plan again, our system security plan, design documentation, system configuration settings, list of rules governing user installed software, system monitoring records, system audit logs, continuous monitoring strategy, and then any other relevant documents over here. Okay. Interviews. Oh, there's Stan. Let Stan in. Interviews. So again, the personnel that are responsible for governing user installed software, the personnel operating, using, or maintaining the system, personnel monitoring compliance with user installed software policy, and then personnel with information security responsibilities and our system or network administrator. So again, those people will always be busy on an auditing compliance visit. Right? And one of the things that I think helps is that when you see a lot of the systems are moving to app stores, or where the applications have to be digitally signed and you have to get them from the app store, and you can't do side loading on some of these devices, that helps control the user installed software, so at least you have some confidence that they're getting it from a legitimate site and not going to a site just to find a nice little holiday screensaver. All right, and again, we test our organizational processes governing user installed software, mechanism enforcing the rules, and then mechanisms for monitoring policy compliance, that they're actually doing it. Okay. Good question, Guillermo. So just wondering why the results of evaluation and testing are not included in acceptable evidence. Are those lumped into other evidence? Yeah, those would probably be lumped into other evidence, but this is just again, it's just a suggested list of assessment documentation methods. Not all organizations are going to have everything on here, and some will have others. So you make a good point there that basically the results of the evaluation and testing that the organization does earlier, that could be included as part of the acceptable evidence that that they're making a good faith effort to control and monitor user installed software. It's a good point. And again, in between all of these different capabilities, there's overlap between them. All right. So I went a little bit slower than I had anticipated. So let's jump into the next one here. I think I'm supposed to give you a break. So the next one is, by the way, we do have one of the eMates, an interactive that's in development for configuration management. It's not quite ready yet. We only have we have a storyboard for developing it, but we don't have it built out yet. But when that's available, that will be made available in this course. So it'll be a nice interactive to help you teach individuals, whether it's students or other employees, about the configuration management. All right, so identification and authentication. So this is, again, a critical piece of our information security. So most of our access control is based on establishing who the user is, their identification, and then authenticating them, authorizing them, and then doing some accountability. Remember our AAA, or IAAA, sometimes identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So where we identify the user, we authenticate them in some fashion, we authorize what resources they can access, and then we account for what they did. We log for what they did. All right. And again, I'm going to go, that's just a generic slide there. So the first one here is identification and then authentication. So here, identify information system users or processes acting on behalf of the users, and you can even have devices, right? And then authentication is we authenticate or verify the identities of the users, the process, or the devices as a prerequisite to allowing access to the information systems. So go through these a little bit more quickly now because I want to make sure. So if we go 15 minutes over right now, then you get 45 minutes for lunch. So Stan, you joined after the break. We're going to take the lunch break. We were going to do it at the top of the hour, but we'll do it 15 minutes after the hour. And then at the next top of the hour, Eric Reniger is going to take over and wrap it up for today. Okay, so and that would be 2 p.m. Central or 3 p.m. Eastern. All right, so identify system users, processes acting on behalf of users and devices. And so system users are identified, processes acting on behalf of users are identified, and devices accessing the system are identified. And again, at least with students, it really takes students a little while to wrap their head around the idea that we have to also be able to authenticate or identify devices, other systems that are accessing our system. So it's not always going to be an individual. It's not always going to be, but again, it can be a process and it can be a device. All right. So again, documentation, identification, and authentication policy, procedures addressing identification and authentication, system security plans, system design documentation, configuration settings, system audit logs and records, list of system accounts, and then other relevant documents or records. Interviews, anyone with system operations responsibilities, information security personnel, system or network administrators. And then here you have the personnel with account management responsibilities. And so again, they're going to be creating the accounts. So whether those are individual user accounts or whether they're system accounts, again, you could have accounts that are associated with services or daemons or processes as well. So again, any of those need to be identified or interviewed. And then finally, system developers. So if you're going to implement this sort of identification, you need to be able to have some custom code potentially from your system developers. And then what do we test? So the organizational processes for identifying and authenticating users, and then the mechanisms for identification and authentication. So same sort of, again, always the processes and then the actual means of implementing it. All right. Next, authentication. So this is again, authenticate or verify the identities of the user, process, or devices, or as prerequisites to allow access. So again, it's not enough to so you show up at the airport, you show your ID to TSA, you pull down your mask today and you have to show them your face, but that's basically identifying yourself. And then they have to authenticate you as well, and that's what your boarding pass is typically doing. Okay, so determine if the identity of each user is authenticated or verified as a prerequisite to system access. So you have to first verify or authenticate that identity. So it's not enough that they present their identity, you have to verify it. The identity of each process acting on behalf of a user is authenticated or verified. And then the identity of each device accessing or connecting to a system is authenticated or verified. And again, these last two are sort of the ones that students struggle until they see some good examples in the actual network infrastructure. That's the two that they most struggle with, the idea of a process having to be authenticated and a device having to be authenticated. All right, and here documentation. So identification, authentication policy, system security plan, the procedures addressing authenticator management. So you may have a server that acts as the authenticator in the system. So basically, how do you address the authenticator management? Procedures for addressing user identification and authentication, system design, list of system authentication types, system configuration settings, change control records associated with the system authenticators, audit logs, and then other relevant documents or records. And then who do we interview? Again, authenticator management responsibilities, and then information security and our generic system or network administrators. And then we evaluate the mechanisms supporting or implementing authenticator management capabilities. So how do we implement this? All right, level 2, we continue here. We have multi-factor authentication. We have replay resistant authentication, and then identifier reuse and identifier handling. So multi-factor authentication is just, we want to enable and make sure that we're using multi-factor authentication for local and network access, particularly for privileged accounts and for access to non-privileged accounts. Okay. Replay resistant attacks. So replay is where somebody has a man-in-the-middle attack, or they're capturing traffic, and then they replay those authentication credentials. The pass the hash attack is a good example, where they capture your hash credentials and then they could use those to authenticate as you. So basically, you put in systems that are resistant to that. And then identifier reuse, you don't want to reuse identifiers for a different defined period of time. And then disable identifiers after a period of inactivity. All right, so multi-factor authentication, I think, is one of the more straightforward things. And again, at my college, I'm part of a pilot group that, so we've set up 2-factor authentication now. And this is what I tell my students. And when we run summer camps for kids, I tell them, any website that you use, you want to make sure that it supports if it supports 2-factor authentication, you want to enable it. And so that's a critical piece of that we want to make sure that they use. So what we do now is we have an authenticator app on our smartphones, or you can get a PIN texted to your smartphone. And so every time I log in to my account for the college from a new device, I have to then authenticate myself with the app or with a text message. Right? So privileged accounts are identified. The multi-factor authentication is implemented for local access to privileged users or accounts. Multi-factor authentication implemented for network access to privileged accounts. So local access and network access, and then multi-factor authentication implemented for network access to non-privileged accounts. So we're doing it as a pilot right now to test it. And my only feedback from the test is that every different college service I have to log in requires this, and it becomes a bit of a cumbersome to have to authenticate, and you have to do it with your phone every time. And sometimes if I go to a classroom to teach, I don't take my phone with me. I don't want to be distracted. And if I want to log into the desktop computer in the classroom and use that to access my learning management shell or my any of my materials, I have to be able to authenticate, because those systems are not my personal systems. I don't have my account information stored on there. All right. So acceptable evidence. So identification and authentication policies, procedures for addressing those, our system security plan, our system design documentation, configuration settings, audit logs, list of system accounts, and any other relevant documents. Who do we interview? Personnel with system operations responsibilities, personnel with account management responsibilities, personnel with information security responsibilities, and then system or network administrators. And finally, again, system developers, because they might play a role in having to implement this. And then how do we test it? We evaluate the mechanisms for supporting or implementing multi-factor authentication. And the tool that I think Christine demonstrated, the tool that's available. That tool is a great way to do this, where basically, because you see so many of the same people showing up in terms of interviews, that you can basically use a tool like that to sort of collect all the information you need to gather from each individual, so that you don't have to go back and interview them, or they don't have to be subject to multiple interviews to collect information across all the different capabilities. All right, employ replay resistant authentication. So again, the idea of a replay is someone captures authentication credentials or authentication traffic and then tries to replay that traffic to the authentication server to log in. So here, replay resistant authentication mechanisms are implemented for network account access to privileged and non-privileged accounts. So the evidence here, again, are identification or INA policy, procedures for user identification authorization, system security, system design, system configuration, audit logs, list of privileged system accounts, and then our other relevant documents or records. And again, same thing, a lot of the documentation that you're going to be requesting overlaps a lot of the different areas. So you want to make sure that when you're reviewing, for example, the system security plan, you look to see all the different capabilities that it addresses. And here, system operations personnel, account management personnel, information security, and then our network or system administrator and system developers. And for some reason, this bullet was combined over here. But again, anytime you're looking at having to put in something in place to stop this sort of replay attack like this, you may need to involve the system developers. And then how do we test it? We test or evaluate our mechanisms for supporting or implementing identification and authentication or replay resistant authentication mechanisms. All right, identifier reuse. Okay, so prevent the reuse of identifiers for a defined period of time. All right, so we have a period within which identifiers cannot be reused. Reuse of identifiers is prevented within that defined period of time. So it could be, so in the example here, the screenshot here, it's a password. So it's basically our maximum password age. So this is our password policies over here, password history, maximum password age, minimum password age, password length, and so on. The evidence here, identification and authentication policy, procedures for addressing identifier management, addressing account management, security plan, system design, system configuration settings, list of system accounts, list of identifiers generated from physical account control devices, and other relevant documents and records. Interviews. So the new one here is, again, identifier management responsibilities. So those personnel, the others are all overlapping with other capabilities. And then we test the mechanisms supporting or implementing identifier management. All right, and then the next one is identifier handling. Let me stop sharing for a second. I want to show you here. So I mentioned that we have, minimize this for a second here. So the NIST special publication 800-171 is just a really good reference to have. And again, I keep it on all of my computers that I use and that I travel with, just because it's just a really good reference to look something up really quickly. So you could obviously Google it and find it whenever you need it. But it's a good one to have, and I encourage students to just have a copy of this handy so that they can look things up and really get it straight from the source. All right, so and this is not the only document that CMMC is based on, but it's one of the primary sources for the CMMC. So for example, over here, if we go to they have a lot of front matter. But if we go over here to the requirements over here, so we'll see that. So right now we're talking about identification and authentication. And so if you click on that, that takes you to that section over there in our PDF view over here in Adobe Acrobat. And you can see here that you get the basic security requirements over here, and you have a nice discussion over here. And I really encourage students to sort of read. So if they're not getting a good sense of these, to go ahead and read through some of these discussions and get a better understanding of it. And then often you will have links to other publications that will give additional guidance. So this one is focused on digital identities. All right. So, and again, you can see this is a derived security requirement, the multi-factor authentication. So again, some of them are basic, and some of them are derived. And then even the footnotes are rich. Again, here's the replay resistant attack. And again, this one again references digital identities over here. And then reuse, again, identifiers provided for users, processes acting on behalf of users or devices. Preventing the reuse implies preventing the assignment of previous use individual, group, role, or device identifiers to different individuals, group, roles, or identifiers. And so it's as simple as just not reusing a username. So that's what we're talking about with identifiers. Right? And again, disable after a defined period of time, enforce minimum password complexity, and so on. So lots of good, rich information here that, again, I want to make sure that you are aware is in that document. Okay, so let's switch back to this. And let me switch my sharing here. All right, so identifier handling, again, disable identifiers after a defined period of time. So again, a period of inactivity after which an identifier is disabled is defined. Identifiers are disabled after the defined period of inactivity. So I can tell you, when I graduated from college, my email account and my access was still active for a long period of time after that. Light went out in John's office. So it was after that they basically set up that ability, so that once a student graduates, they might get transitioned to an alumni email address so that they can still keep in touch with the students, or they might collect that information from them, but their regular student account was disabled for after some period of inactivity. All right. Acceptable evidence here. Again, the identification and authentication policy, procedures for addressing identifier management, addressing account management. The security plan is there again, system design, system configuration settings, list of system accounts, list of identifiers generated from physical access control devices, and then other relevant documents. Again, remember, the identifiers are not only for individuals. It could be if you're part of a group. So if you have some group permissions, if it could be for processes on behalf of us of a user, and it could also be devices. Interviews, again, whoever's responsible for identifier management. And then we have our information security, system or network administrators, and system developers. And again, we test the mechanisms supporting or implementing identifier management. Okay. Here, this is password complexity, password reuse, temporary passwords, cryptographically protected passwords, and then obscure feedback. And again, those I think are fairly straightforward. I'll go through these a little bit more quickly just because we're going to run out of time over here. But basically enforce a minimum password complexity and change of characters when new passwords are created. Now, I can tell you that there's a document making the rounds on Twitter that shows that even for long passwords with long complexity, with full complexity, it's about 2 days with modern technology to crack the password. All right. So again, password complexity is defined, the password change of character requirements defined, and then they're enforced when new passwords are created, and then the minimum password change of character requirements are defined and enforced as well. The evidence over here, the new one is going to be your password policy. Okay. Interviews, again, authenticator management, and again, the same suspects here as before. And again, we evaluate the mechanisms supporting or implementing our password-based authenticator management capability. All right, let me see. Let me see if I can find that document for you. I'm not on my computer, so I don't have it handy. I will, when I get back to my laptop, I'll post it here to the course. I'll upload it to the files there. But again, the gist of it is that the technology, both the hardware has gotten better, the algorithms have gotten better, and so it doesn't matter anymore. Yeah, this is for 2002. So let me see if I can open it here. Well, all these sites will want to. It wants me to log in to download it, but let me see if I can just zoom in here. Let's see. I'm a Mac person too, so it's all right. So I can read this out for you here, but basically this is the number of characters over here in the left-hand column, and then you have numbers only, lowercase letters, upper and lowercase letters, numbers and uppercase and lowercase letters, and then numbers, uppercase and lowercase letters, and symbols. So that's basically full complexity here. And you can see here, this isn't the, so if you look here, so again, people think an 8-character password is a strong password here. But if you look at this, that's eight hours to crack an 8-character password with full complexity. All right. So if we're telling students to basically come up with a complex password that's 8 characters long, if that's the minimum length, we're doing them a disservice. All right. So again, the guidance now, so even NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their latest guidance is that we shouldn't have our users change passwords so often. So right now, my college does it every 90 days. We should instead change passwords on an event-based basis. So if there's some event that we think that there may have been a breach, or if we think that a student's account may have been compromised, then we initiate a password change, but we don't do it just every 90 days, because what happens is users will make poor judgments in coming up with new passwords. So their passwords will be too similar to their past passwords, so they might add a new character to it and so on. So same thing over here, prohibit password reuse for a specified number of generations. And again, that's all of our systems are, so for example, our local security policy and our group policy and Active Directory will all allow us to do this. But again, the goal here, the number of generations during which a password cannot be reused is specified. Reuse of password is prohibited. But again, what people will do is they'll just add a couple new characters to their password and use the same password just for convenience. So we almost encourage that by forcing them to change it more often than they may need to. Right. So the better solution is to have them pick a long passphrase that's very difficult to crack. Okay. And again, our password policy shows up over here. Interviews, again, authenticator management, and system developers, as you would expect if we want to enable that. And again, test our mechanisms supporting or implementing password-based authenticator management capability. All right. Temporary passwords, allow temporary password use for system logins and then have an immediate change to a permanent password. So those are fairly straightforward. Again, I think on our end of the business, on this information security side, understanding passwords and what we need to do with passwords is fairly straightforward. So an immediate change to a permanent password is required when a temporary password is used for a system logon. So if somebody resets their password, they get a temporary password. As soon as they log in, they have to change their password. And even the link for the password expiration might be limited in time, so that if they don't use that link to change their password or use the temporary password, it expires after a certain length of time. The evidence here, again, our password policy and identification and authentication policy show up. And the password configurations, here is a new one here. Interviews, again, our authenticator management shows up over here. And then what do we test? The mechanisms supporting or implementing password-based authenticator management capability. Okay. Cryptographically protected passwords. We want to store and transmit only cryptographically protected passwords. And again, it's not that organizations are not doing that, but again, you want to be able to document for an auditor that any information, login information, password information being transmitted, stored, or even used. So basically, you look at data at rest, data in motion with transmitted, and then data in use. All of that password information has to be stored cryptographically or transmitted cryptographically. So passwords are cryptographically protected in storage, cryptographically protected in transit. The evidence here, again, password policies, procedures addressing authenticator management. And let's see, password configurations. All right, so nothing new there. And then interviews, again, the individual responsible for authenticator management responsibilities. So the authenticator management is basically the authentication server that's going to do the authentication. And how do we test it? we evaluate the mechanisms supporting or implementing password-based authenticator management capability. Again, just to ensure that anywhere the password is stored or transmitted, it's always cryptographically protected. And then obscure the feedback. I think John showed you the CIA or the Macumber cube and the example of having the password not show up. And in Linux, when you type the password in Linux, when you're typing, you use sudo and then you're typing the password to escalate privileges, it doesn't show you typing. And so students often get confused thinking that the command line is broken. So they have to understand that it's just a security feature that it doesn't show. So basically you obscure the authentication information during the process. So that the previous capability was focused on storage and transmission of passwords. This is focused on the use of passwords. So when we use the passwords, we don't see the actual characters here as we're typing. All right, so they're obscured. And in some cases, again, at the Linux command line, we might not even see the typing. So the evidence here, a new one here is procedures addressing authenticator feedback. So the feedback that the authentication server gives you here. Interviews, again, we need to include the system developer to make sure that that's implemented. And then finally, we're going to test the implementation of obscuring of feedback of authentication information during authentication. All right, so that is that chapter.